very warm welcome to you, gentlemen. I suppose the very first thing that we do have to first talk about, even before the appointment, and to speak to our viewers and and everybody that is watching, is the chairmanship and the AU Commission. I mean, they're two different things, and what they are supposed to be doing, it's not the same thing. So just talk to us about the significance of this particular post.
Well, it's really the unofficial, it's the executive position within the African Union. Now, clearly there are the structures, the heads of state positions, etc. But this person is the face of the African Union. This person is the executive director, the president, if you like, of the Secretary General, if you like, of the AU, and is the face in interactions with the rest of the world, is in the face in interactions with government, is the face in interactions on all of the big questions of the African.
Because my understanding of it was that this is the body that actually does the implementation of what the AU decides to do. I want to come to you, Ibrahim, and some of the comments that have been coming out is that South Africa bullied its way into this position. What do you think?
I'm not a fan of that view. I mean, it's a very popular view that there is this agreement that big states on the continent shouldn't be taking leadership roles, especially at the AU. Now, I think that may be a good position, but it's a good position henceforth, not just yet. I think what's going on, in fact, is not so much a question of bullying, and more a question of who can actually do the job, who can fix this institution which appears to be unfixable, who can define a coherent line, who can facilitate the disparate political voices which do often emerge on the continent, and let's have that for this period. Because there is a fallout, let's face it, there's a fallout over Cote d'Ivoire, there's a fallout over Egypt, there's been a fallout massively over Libya. Someone needs to construct a coherent line, firstly, and someone needs to bolster the administrative and executive ability of the African Union to in fact make decisions and implement them.
Where did the controversy come from? Because I mean, there were about 3 rounds of voting before this actually happened, and it seemed as though, I mean, not only some of the issues that you've raised, but it also seems as though there was the Anglophone side and the Francophone side that came into play as well. So why so much controversy?
Let's be honest, let's see what the game plan is. The game plan is that in Libya and in Cote d'Ivoire, African leaders were outmaneuvered by the West. And a large number of leaders on the African continent, whether fairly or not, felt that the African Union's inability to act, its lack of a coherent line, was not simply about the inefficiencies of Mr. Ping, but it also had to do with the fact that France has too much control over the African Union, particularly over Francophone Africa, particularly through Francophone Africa. And that was the reason why South Africa at this historical moment, despite all of the unwritten rules about not
But how accurate is that view? I mean, taking into consideration that South Africa has taken a huge lead in some of the conflicts that have been taking place on the African continent, how accurate is that view?
Well, I think that there's an element of truth that we were outmaneuvered in Libya and clearly in Cote d'Ivoire. The African Union didn't have a coherent position in that regard. We didn't act coherently. And clearly, what some countries on the African continent feel, it's time to win back the African Union to get to the agenda. That then raises what Ibrahim does. Well, now you have it. What are you going to do with it? How do you establish and heal a divided continent within the African Union? How do you build the institutional capacities? And ultimately, when push comes to shove, Africa doesn't have significant power. How do you go about crafting the leverage required to intervene the next time?
Are you then saying, and Ibrahim, I'm going to ask you this question, are you then saying that South Africa is the country to do it? And that I'm asking that because there has been this view that South Africa seems to have this perception of it's South Africa and then there's the rest of Africa.
I mean, I'm not a fan of this view that South Africa is simply a hegemon on the continent. I mean, it appears that might be the case. And it may in fact have been the case under Thabo Mbeki, where I think we were literally throwing our weight around. I think the Jacob Zuma administration is attempting to craft a different line. Now, you may well make serious accusations and allegations against the Zuma administration that it didn't have, and in fact still doesn't have, a coherent overarching foreign policy defined by foreign policy goals. That may have been true, but I think that there is a new narrative emerging. There's a new narrative emerging both domestically and internationally. So far from the fact that there's a African agenda which has simply fallen through the cracks, there is in fact an African agenda emerging under this president.
Let's talk a little bit about Ms. Dlamini-Zuma as in the role. I mean, she's minister right now, and some of the roles that she's had, she's been Minister of Health, she's been Minister of Foreign Affairs, now she's Minister of Home Affairs, and just how much will she bring to this, considering the portfolios that she's been, the roles that she's played in these departments? How strong a leader is she going to be to bring all this coherence, to bring all these things that are not working, to actually make them, you know, gel together and to be able to work together as they should?
Let's start with what her job is. Her job is to heal the African continent. This is going to be this was a very divisive contest. Clearly, people are unhappy. South Africa can't do this on its own. It doesn't have the strength or the leverage. Clearly, she needs to craft an agenda. Now, given the fact that she was foreign policy minister, she's interacted on this continent. She knows these leaders. She's interacted with the African Union. She brings that kind of experience. The second thing that she does have is an enormous amount of administrative experience. She's taken departments and turned them around and created the institutional coherence and the administrative competence of departments. And that's the other thing you're going to need to do in the African Union. Its administrative coherence hasn't been great. It hasn't been able to undertake the kinds of responsibilities. So actually, the one thing that I think a lot of people will agree with is if there's going to be somebody from Southern Africa, Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma is perhaps the best person to do it, irrespective of whether she's a woman. She's the best person.
Irrespective, Adam.
Well, I think it's, you know, the people are making this the case that this is an affirmative action appointment. I don't think it's an affirmative action appointment. I think this is the best candidate for the job from the Southern African continent, and it's got nothing to simply do with the fact that she's a woman. The fact that she's a woman is a bonus, but she is the best candidate to do this job, man or woman, from the Southern Africa.
Yeah, in many ways, I mean, if I drew up an ideal candidate for this position, I think it will be her.
I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that she's going to have to do, because I would imagine even before she can even start talking about conflict, about trade and all of those things, like you say, she's first going to have to put the house in order and first see that the AU is actually doing what it's supposed to do. Looking at how she's come into this position, looking at the controversy, how much support is she going to have from people that are in the structure right now?
Well, look, you know, the voting patterns already show clear divisions, okay? But if you go through every successive round of voting, you'll find there's a greater number of people who've come in. So the facilitative role that they've played in bringing a greater number of people over to their view, onto their side, has obviously increased, even in one short night. Now, I think you give her enough time and she might be able to craft some facilitated position on a whole range of issues, particularly contentious ones, like interventions in Mali, like what it would continue to do about many flashpoints, Somalia, Kenya going through a new constitution writing process, Zimbabwe, who meant to finish the constitution writing process and go through an election. So there's many issues that she's going to have to fall back on and craft some kind of consensus around. I think given time, she will. The problems for her are going to be the flashpoints, which are going to emerge as flash in the pans. So if you have an election coming soon and there's massive conflict which is going to emerge, I think that's going to take her attention away from it. So that's the political stuff that she has to deal with. Then she's got the administrative, executive stuff to deal with. Capacity in the commission, administrative staff, the bureaucracy, the rules for procedure for decision making are often not abided by simply because you know, they're not that very well developed in the first instance. And then she's got the interface between the legislative arm, which is the Pan-African Parliament, which meets merely once a year and makes some critical decisions, many which go completely unimplemented, and how to craft a role between the legislature and the executive, and how the Commission's actually going to take decisions made by the Pan-African Parliament and implement them.
How much of that decision do you think is going to receive some kind of direction from South Africa as a country?
I think she'll have a relative autonomy. I think South Africa was looking for somebody to begin to provide leadership at the African Union. I expressed that they were very concerned about the fact of Western influence on the African Union. I think they see her as a relatively autonomous person, but independent. She's no pushover by any means. I think the first thing she's going to do is start making bridging divides with Francophone Africa. I think that's the first thing she has to do. Before getting anything right, she has to heal the divides that this contest has created. Once she's done that, then she creates the political platform to do all of the other things. And I think that first visit, I wouldn't be surprised, to Gabon,
I would add the rider that, I mean, it's not just Francophone Africa. I mean, we've got bridges to heal with Nigeria, with fellow Anglophone countries. Of course, there's also the perception, as you pointed out earlier, that South Africa is viewed as a hegemon. I'm not sure we're going to get away from that view, because look, the reality is that we are probably the most able, and I say this advisedly, the most able country with the highest GDP, with the highest amounts of economic growth, or probably not growth, but growth from a much higher point than many other countries. And then, of course, there's the access with Angola. So, President Zuma's relationship with Dos Santos in Angola, I think, does craft some kind of facilitated bridge line between the different divides.
Ibrahim, I did want to ask you about Angola, because Angola was very supportive of South Africa getting this appointment. How important a player is Angola becoming, as and I would imagine it's also as its economy grows and how much influence it has on the continent.
It's I think it's worth bearing in mind that it's both an asset and a liability.
Absolutely.
It's an asset because it's an important country, it's growing, it's one of the fastest growing economies on the continent, it has enormous amount of resources. The relationship between South Africa and Angola was horrendous under Thabo Mbeki. Jacob Zuma has played a big role in actually healing that divide, etc. Having said that, there are other players that we need to be cognizant of. Nigeria is a clear player, Egypt is another, Kenya is another, Senegal is another. We need to be able to move between this. And I think if there's a candidate who could do that, by the way, it's Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma. I think South Africa's role is to say, we've done this, now we're going to step back, play the role that you need to play.
I want to talk a little bit about Kenya, because this is something you mentioned. We had the story of Al-Shabaab and how much of a threat that is, not only to Kenya, but perhaps, to other countries on the African continent. Let's just speak to that, because I think that's another issue, is the security issues that we have on the African continent.
Well, obviously peace and security is going to be one of her key issues before she comes to questions of integration and trade and so forth, which are going to be equally important. I mean, this one's theme was about inter-African trade. But peace and security is not very far off the agenda. It's always there. I hate to say this, and it's very difficult to actually verbalize this without sort of sending signals to people who are very untoward in our societies, generally, is that in Kenya, the perception was that here's a government which made decisions to go and make forays into Somalia by providing peacekeeping troops through the AU or whatever. So even though it's a multilateral action, these militants, or whatever you might call them, in Al-Shabaab view this as a decision made by a particular country and therefore begin to think that this country ought to be an appropriate and legitimate target for whatever we want to do. Now, there may well become risks where she's seen to be making decisions about making AU deployments, troops from the AU deployed in certain flashpoints, where those militants might decide, well, this was a decision made by a figurehead from this particular country, and therefore that becomes a legitimate target. Now, it's very unfortunate that this stuff does become reducible, but it's a reality we're dealing with.
But I think that the Kenyan engagement in Somalia is a very slightly different one. I think we have to bear in mind that firstly, it's a neighboring country. Secondly, both Kenya and Ethiopia have had and adopted a very 9/11 approach to the question of Al-Shabaab and Somalia. And South Africa has been fairly critical of that. South Africa has been very, very reticent to simply take an American-British approach to understanding Somalia. I think that Somalia, one of the big mistakes that has been made both by the West, but also Ethiopia and Kenya, is to assume conservative is the same thing as militaristic. Sure. And what you've done in that case is taken a conservative movement and militarized it and actually regionalized the war that is coming in. And that's the real danger.
Another thing that has been a huge issue for Africa, not today and not in the past 10 years, for a really long time, is this issue of who's actually running the show. Is it Africans that are running the show? Are we being told from outside forces what should be happening on the African continent? How much is that going to play a role? Because when we talk about development, when we talk about economics, that plays a huge role on where we are when we talk about Doha and how that fell apart, and other things that have tried to put Africa on the forefront, and South Africa now being in BRICS is that going to help? But how much of that needs to be taken cognizant of in the position that she's going to be in, of Africa actually having an agenda and being respected for that agenda and doing things the way that Africa would like to, not having external factors?
I think that's the fundamental issue. I think if there's a fundamental reason why Nkosazana is sitting in this job at the moment, it's amongst a fair degree of African leaders to say, we now want to take control of that. We now want to craft an independent African agenda. We want to engage the world, but we want to make sure that we're not simply a proxy for external powers deciding it. And that's the real elephant in the room. That was the real attempt to push Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma into the... And I think if there's going to be a candidate who can do that, who's got a relative autonomy, but is no pushover, that who is interested in crafting an African agenda, then it's Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma.
I want to ask you about this. We have to go back to this francophone anglophone issue, because at the end of the day, that has also come into play of how much of a role is France playing. Now, to be able to break that away, to be able to because at the end of the day, what I'm hearing you say is that francophone countries are going to have to break away from that. How do you do that? Because this is years and years of being in that state.
I think that's the real art of what Nkosazana is going to have to do. That actually a lot of Francophone Africa is now going to be really peeved, because essentially what South Africa was saying is that you were not independent, that you were being effectively a proxy for France, that you allowed them undue influence, and they're going to be really peeved about this. What Nkosazana has to do is bridge that divide and say there are ways for you to continue your engagements with France, to continue your history, but still retain a degree of autonomy and independence. And that's the importance. It's the art of politics. And that's why I think if she doesn't get that right, we can put paid to any coherent African agenda emerging.
Ibrahim, I'm going to give you the last
word.
I'm
not always convinced that this is a conditioning which has happened through culture. I think a significant amount of it has happened through both trade and aid. So here's her problem, and this is where the interlinkages between politics, security, defense, and trade is going to be a critical one. Because if you're going to have to provide incentives to many of these countries, that those things that you get from France are going to become available on the continent and from the continent. So the BRICS, South Africa's influence through BRICS may well assist in that regard if you can get enough goods and services into these countries in the same way that they've been used to this thing coming from France. That's the first problem. The second is the question of sovereignty is an important one. But the reality is that, it's not just sovereignty that matters. The way state management and state ability matters equally as much. Now, you asked a question earlier about Angola. One is going to hope that though Angola becomes an important and critical player on the African continent, that it can get its own internal affairs in order. So you've got to have effective regulatory systems, you've got to have an effective regulatory regime. This simply doesn't exist in a country like Angola. Now, she's got an incredibly tough job. I don't think this is going to be easy for her, but if there's anyone who has the ability to do it, it's her. But let's not expect great successes within 5 years. I suspect we're going to give this a heck of a lot of time.
I would imagine after all this controversy, there will be tons of expectation.
But look, she's going to get the building blocks in place. So we need to temper what our expectations are going to be of the kind of achievements she can actually deliver at the end of 5 years.
Thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen. Fantastic discussion.